Right, welcome to another episode of Researching Happy. My name's Matthew Iciello. This is the podcast all about the research world of happiness and well-being. So if you're new to the show, what we normally do is host conversations with people that are involved in some way in the research world of happiness or well-being. And as if you have been around, you would have heard so many of the guests so far talking about the importance, obviously, of the outputs of the research world, but also then the translation of that research into the quote unquote real world. And that's an example of something I'd like to talk about today. This is going to be a bit of a different spin. So for those of you sort of playing at home, I've been traveling overseas, so I haven't had a couple of episodes sort of drop out, trying to make up some ground. So I thought what would be a really interesting approach today was to try a book review. I haven't done a book review since I was thinking about it the other day, probably year 11 or something. I think it was Catch 22. I think it was my book review. I wasn't very good at English in school. But what I want to try today is a new book about happiness, which just came out. And, in the world of the internet, popular people sell lots of books. And so this book is probably, I think, going to become one of the most sold happiness books of all time. So I think it makes sense that we pay attention to it. So the book is called The Sad Truth About Happiness, SAAD, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life by Professor Gad Saad. So in the world of online echo chambers, you probably fall into one of 3 categories. You've either never heard of Gad Saad, or you have heard of him, in which case you love him or you hate him. Just basically depending on which chamber you fall into. So Gad is a professor of marketing at Concordia University in Canada. He escaped as I think a teenager or a child the Lebanese Civil War and migrated with his family to Canada. Gad Saad has pioneered the use of evolutionary psychology and marketing and consumer behavior. And in the sense of translating research into the real world, his blog for Psychology Today and his YouTube channel, The Sad Truth, have garnered combined nearly 40 million views, respectively. So on that show, if you Google Gad Saad, you can probably find some people who have been upset by the things that he's said. Although I think he's a very balanced guy, he just finds himself in one of those positions where he informs people and upsets people like only an evolutionary theorist can in the year 2023. And I think that's epitomized by the tagline of his show on YouTube. The truth can hurt, the truth can set you free, but you can't hide from the sad truth. So why do this review? Like I said, I'm partially making up for lost episodes, but more importantly, it's important to see what's out there. Like the research world, as we've had so many guests say in the past, you write a paper, it gets published, you might get 2,000 downloads or 10,000 downloads, mostly by people who either aren't reading it very closely or who are sitting within their own little silo. And so when someone has so much online attention, they're obviously going to do... They've got the chance of, I guess, really creating some serious reach about the idea of happiness. And so Gad, with such an online presence, is out there. And again, like I said, this will be the most read happiness book within at least recent memory. The second is that I'm just excited to see what Gad says. I think he's a public intellectual. And he's from outside of the world of happiness, I guess, like at least the world of happiness research. Maybe he would disagree with that, but looking at sort of like track record, it's not like he's a guy from PosPsych or someone that's written a lot about life satisfaction or happiness in general. So really interested to see what someone from an outside perspective would have to say. So let's start with the cover of the book. I think Gad, as you'll hear me say, has a really great sense of humor. And I think the cover is the beginning, to give you a bit of a point of where he's coming from. If you didn't know his personality, I think you'd look at this and think like, this is a bit of a, this is kind of like just a standard Woman's Weekly kind of like well-being guru kind of person. But I think this is Gad's sarcasm shining through. He knows exactly what he's making fun of, and he's leaning right into that. So, you can look. I don't know. You look into those eyes, and you can see he's pulling a joke already on this whole field. I mean, we go into Gad, what he calls himself. He's known by a few different monikers: the Gadfather, the Honey Badger, and recently, having lost a little bit of weight, Dr. Good Looks. You go on Twitter, you see that it's mostly witty sort of shots around the place. So, speaking of shots, I guess, so he clearly has ideas, political ideas, and throughout the book, you'll hear a few shots at his sort of favorite targets. In his own words, the Blue Haired Mafia, AOC, the pronoun Taliban, and CNN's Brian Stelter. And I think if you are a fan of Gad, you'll have a laugh at that. If you're not a fan of Gad, you can easily ignore these things and just kind of breeze straight past them. They don't really get in the way of the book at all. So next, let's go into the start, the blurb, the Amazon blurb. So the book is described as so. Professor and de facto global therapist to an ever-growing audience of hundreds of thousands of people builds on national bestseller The Parasitic Mind to argue that happiness is not merely a changeable mood, but a process toward which we can strive by following some basic steps that have been known to humans for millennia. Or so says Professor Gad Saad, author of the sensational national bestseller The Parasitic Mind, the popular host of the Sad Truth podcast. Professor Saad roams through the scientific studies, the wisdom of ancient philosophy and religion, and his extraordinary personal experience as a refugee from war-torn Lebanon turned academic celebrity to provide one of the most provocative, helpful, and entertaining listens you're likely to encounter. In The Sad Truth About Happiness, you'll learn the secrets to living the good life, including how to live the life you want, not necessarily the life expected of you, why resilience is a key to happiness, why your career needs to have a higher purpose than a paycheck, how variety turns out to be the spice of life, why marriage is so important, how Aristotle had it right when he preached moderation, and why you should take a hint from your dog and realize that playfulness equals happiness. Enlightening, bold, and good-humored, The Sad Truth About Happiness is a lively, stimulating, and captivating as its author, who has become a de facto global therapist to an ever-growing audience of hundreds of thousands of people. Listen to this book, and you'll see why so many seek his counsel. All right, so some big claims there, and we'll sort of work through them as we go. Interesting. I don't know if I had like the audiobook version of Amazon there, and it talks about sort of listening to the book, but that's probably a sign of the times. But anyway, whatever. So I think just, to give a high level summary, I think most of those claims are sort of met, to be honest. I think it is an entertaining listen or read. I don't know that it's certainly that provocative, to be honest with you. I think it's pretty grounded, but certainly sort of helpful and entertaining. Those dot points that I sort of read through about the secrets of living the good life, they roughly mirror, I guess, the 8 chapters or the 8 ideas that are useful to happiness. And I think a lot of them, if you're listening to this show and you've sort of been in the post-psych world for a while, a lot of them are sort of the bread and butter, I guess, of happiness. But I think there's some really interesting perspectives. The way it's not so much the novelty of what's in the book, it's the way that it's described, the way that I think it's contextualized. And you can see that even some of these dot points, the idea that this isn't just about what's good for you. I think happiness research is really about, it often takes the frame of, this is good for you, almost from a medical model, like this will either prevent a bad thing, or it will, it will prevent future mental illness, or it will promote your health. Whereas I think Gad has probably done a really good job of sort of merging this into like the things we're wanting. He's a marketing professor, so he sort of has got the pitch right, I think, which is something we could all really learn from. So if I was to give the book like a high-level summary, I would call it absolutely a very enjoyable read. It was a brief read that takes you through Happiness 101 in an enjoyable way. I don't think it promises you any answers, which is an important thing to say here, but it points you in the right direction to some considerations that you may have overlooked in life. And I think I would really contextualize that, compare it to the sort of the airport bookshop guru books that you might find, and to be honest, the ones that I think Gad might be taking a bit of a sarcastic swing at with his book cover. That this is not just like, here are my 5 tips that are going to change your life. This is actually inviting you to reflect on what is important to you and how you might think about your life through a different lens, having read the book. I forgot to mention in terms of like why do the review. I was in Canada for the International Positive Psychology Association conference over the weekend. And, so this is basically a conference about happiness by happiness researchers. And Gad's book came out at the same time, basically at the same weekend. So it could have been interesting that he could have actually been there to sort of talk about the book. But that really raised the point, I guess, for me, is that these are two disparate worlds that never really meet. This sort of public intellectual world, talking about happiness and well-being, it doesn't really overlap with the people that are sort of doing the research. So while I had a 15-hour, whatever, flight home from Vancouver to Sydney, I read through Gad's book, and that's where we're at. Might clip that and put that at the front of the podcast because it makes more sense right at the front. So before I read the book, I jotted down some initial thoughts on the book, which I'll sort of run through like question and answer. So I had some questions. So will happiness be defined, if at all? How much will positive psychology be included in the book? How will Gad balance individual agency over happiness compared with external conditions in life? Will there be decision-making research in the book? So will there be an overlap between, I guess, more Gad's professional career versus sort of the happiness topic? And lastly, like, will it be good? I was mostly concerned that this book would be a bestseller before even a page has been opened, just due to Gad's online popularity. You want to support Gad, you buy the book, pre-order it, and so it opens on the first day on Amazon as a bestseller. So it doesn't really give, it's not a huge drive, I guess, for this to be a fantastic book. I can imagine compared to some of his earlier books that were probably tied a bit closer to his sort of daily research life, where, he was an up-and-coming emerging person, something like The Parasitic Mind. There's more at stake, basically. Whereas now I was concerned that, there might not necessarily be that much at stake, knowing that it's a bestseller before it's even been opened. Obviously, I think that Gad has, I think that Gad has probably more rigor than that. I think that he's, more virtuous than that, I think, just to sort of phone it in. And to answer that question, basically, I think that it is a good book. It's a great book. Like I said, it's this happiness 101, but really from a different perspective to what Pos Psych would have taken. So we'll get into that in a middle, but that's the first question. Is it good? I think it's good, which I'm glad that it's the case, and it's not, I don't think that Gad's this phony guy who's just out there to sell books. So going back to the top, how will happiness be defined? So if you've been watching the show, you know that defining happiness and well-being is something that's important to us in this show. And to be honest, like I said, I got on the flight from Vancouver we bought it at midnight. So I tried to stay up as long as I could while I was reading the book, but also so that I'd come back to an Australian time zone. So I easily could have missed if happiness was defined. I didn't really get the sense that it was clearly defined, like explicitly. But it was certainly a nice, he had the focus on sort of more persistent feelings of fulfillment rather than happiness merely as a positive emotion. But I think he did the right thing by not discounting, the sort of the immediate hedonistic pleasure with, more eudaimonic long-term fulfillment. So I think he sort of covered off all bases, which is fine. And I think in the sort of the introduction chapters, he did point out the idea of happiness being both an antecedent and an outcome, which is an important nuance that's often missed. This idea that happiness is valuable in its own right, but it's also a valuable intermediate for future things as well. So how much would pos psych be included in the book? Surprisingly, a lot, to be honest. I thought there was a chance that the whole literature could have been mostly overlooked, and maybe I'm just stuck in my mind about the sort of the reliability and trustability of positive psychology is kind of outdated now, and that's what we sort of following the conference, that it's taking some big leaps, I think, into the future. So that was endorsed, I guess, in the book, that there were a lot of key researchers from the sort of pos psych world who are referenced in Gad's book, many of whom were actually at IPPA at the conference. So that was a nice sort of tie-in, talking about these two worlds that don't really overlap. It looks like there's a bit of overlap occurring. Just out of interest for those who care, I don't know who cares or not, but at the IPPA conference, I think Robert Biswas-Diener raised a really interesting point about novelty in the positive psychology research world, and I guess he shared an anecdote about sending a really novel topic to the Journal of Positive Psychology, which he said was rejected basically for not being theoretical or novel enough, although he made the point that nothing had been published on this topic ever. The Journal of Happiness Studies was referenced 18 times in the book, whereas the Journal of Positive Psychology referenced only 4 times. Now, I know that doesn't mean really anything, but it was an interesting, I think, in terms of like if you talk impact factors and sort of reach, you would assume the Journal of Pos Psych has this bigger, more impactful sort of literature base, but interesting to see the Journal of Happiness Studies, much more reference there. That doesn't mean anything, not really. But the point is, the field of positive psychology and the researchers that sort of identify with it were throughout this book, which was nice to see. So did he get the balance? How did he balance individual agency over external conditions in terms of the ability to build happiness? So there are two levels, two extremes, I guess, when we're thinking about this. There's one group who are talking about happiness is fully in your control. It doesn't matter where you're at, you can be happy. And there's the other that says basically your happiness is almost entirely controlled by the circumstances you find yourself in, many of which are out of your control. And these two groups basically clash all the time. And I think Gad struck the balance right, in my opinion. Of course that, making the argument that of course external conditions can have a significant impact, but there are always aspects within our control. And that sometimes, that's the best we can do in life, is focus on the things that are within our control when it comes to our happiness and well-being. I think Gad makes the extremely relevant scenario. He points to the extremely relevant scenario where people can have the same life experiences or the same life circumstances, but have very different levels of happiness. And that's true basically from the richest to the poorest, that it doesn't matter at which point you're at. There's lots of variance, I guess, within each step of that continuum or something like that. Which brings me to the last one, which was, Gad Saad is a decision and marketing researcher. He even has a TED talk on the evolutionary roots of human decision making. So I was wondering how much would that literature feature in the book? And that's probably my disappointment in the book, is that I would have liked to see a bit more of that research when it comes to sort of practical tools for people. I can probably give an argument for why it wasn't included, but I think for myself, a lot of the chapters raise big questions for people, like finding a partner or finding the right job. These are huge decisions, and I think it would have been interesting to see a little bit more about the process of decision making when it comes to such big choices, and even like if there are some like rudimentary sort of practical tools for people to help there. So I'll give an argument in a minute why I think why that shouldn't be there, but I think I would have liked to see probably a little bit more. It just felt like a bit of a missed opportunity for me, to give someone like a framework of like how should you go about this thing. So throughout the book, as I was reading, I don't want to give away the 8 chapters because I guess that's the sort of the IP of the book. So what I want to talk is I guess 3 raised questions that I think the book highlighted for me. So these is kind of, I guess, reading between the lines, not necessarily that these were explicitly raised, but the 3 questions that came out for me were, well, the first one was, where should happiness recommendations come from? So, sorry, give me one sec. Yeah. So where should happiness recommendations come from? I think the book brings a really nice lens about how to make recommendations on happiness. You could say, should it come from ancient traditions? Should it come from religion? Should it come merely from scientific literature? Some people take either of those positions, and I think Gad, again, has struck the balance exactly right. There's a phrase that I probably learned from Gad Saad, and I've forgotten what it's called, but it's almost like epistemic, like layering, something like that. Like I'll know something's true if it remains to be true across many layers of knowledge. And I think that's really where this book does a really nice job. Something that I probably haven't seen so much in the past is this idea of, let's start with ancient wisdom and from a range of traditions, see that something is true across ancient wisdom, then apply this evolutionary lens to the book, or to this whatever this recommendation is. Apply an evolutionary lens, really showing here's why it might be the case. Not only that it's important, but why it might be important. Often pointing to ways we could almost hijack an evolutionary trait and make it more productive for us rather than less productive for us and our happiness. And then demonstrating academic support for that idea at the end. So it starts really broad and then gets quite narrow at the end. And I think that's almost this filter for recommendations that the eight points that Gad makes are sort of applied through. And I think it's just a nice approach. I think we've talked a lot on the show about the risk of scientism, the idea that like falling into the trap that thinking, scientific evidence can explain all things. And whilst it definitely has its place, it's not the whole thing. And I think Gad has done a really great job of pulling these various ways of knowing together for a really nice concrete set of recommendations. You'll have heard on a couple of episodes, particularly with my colleague Joep van Agteren, that something that we've been really arguing against in the research and happiness, the happiness research world, is the arbitrary nature of many of the decisions that are made. So, you get things like, here are the 5 ways to build happiness, or these 3 things will change your life, whatever. That kind of mentality is put out into the world. And people go wrong where they pretend or they express that these things are almost universal. And I think Gad has sidestepped this issue, firstly by never making the claim that these are universal. What's the title of the book? It's The Sad Truth. It's his opinion, which is a nice sort of admission. It's a good opinion, but it's his opinion. But I think so he's not claiming that these things are universal, but by drawing on tradition and evolutionary theory, there is this confidence instilled that, while these points aren't, these 8 recommendations aren't the only recommendations, that's what I meant by universal there. I meant complete. While these aren't all encompassing all the recommendations that you need, here are 8 that you can have a lot of confidence in, basically. And I think that's just a nice style. So the second raised point, I guess, is this balance between sort of individual responsibility versus sort of paternalistic advice. So I think there's really this tradition of saying, like, here are the 5 things and here's exactly how you do them. That's almost comes from this very paternalistic lens to building happiness. And so I'm a bit conflicted by the earlier comments that I made about being disappointed by the lack of support or the lack of advice on how to make decisions. I think it is a balancing act between this sort of modern need for easy answers, like just give me the top 10 ways, put it in a list on Reddit for me or something, versus the need for people to adopt responsibility or for introspection or reflection in their own life and arrive at that answer in time. And I think Gad, basically any episode of anything he's ever done would tell you that he's against sort of modern paternalistic approaches. And I agree that in many ways for a generic book, that wouldn't be effective anyway, to sort of say like, this is how you do it. So I think what he's done in the book really nicely is left the door wide open for people to investigate their own lives. And in most importantly, I guess, there is no way of knowing most of this stuff other than to try one way. Like if you say like what's the answer to this thing in your life, you don't really know. So the answer instead is to try something, to be paying attention, and to continue to learn along the way. And I think that's where the anecdotes in every chapter really paint a nice picture of a life course of learning and tweaking to improve happiness in his life. So the third highlight that the book raised for me was then the intentionality of happiness. So really is intentionality the driver of happiness? I think it raised the question of how many of our decisions that we make in life, the big ones and the small ones, are actually influenced by other forces, particularly when they're sort of unintentional or implicit. And I think that really speaks to that dot point, live the life you want, not necessarily the life expected of you. I think we so often fall into the lives that are expected of us or the roles that are expected of us, to our detriment, basically. And so I think so many of the chapters and the sort of the recommendations of happiness are really about offering a range of places to examine your life. I think so much of the psychological literature and most of these happiness books and even the work that we do, not that, it's very programmatized. So it's very much like, here's a thing, here are some psychological skills that can be useful. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but I think it was a nice breath of fresh air in a way, to rather than say like, here are some practical things you can take, here are some skills you can take. It was more like, here are a range of places that you can examine in your life, as I said. It draws on Socrates, obviously, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think it was a useful style to introduce many of these key concepts of happiness to a large audience. So obviously one recommendation works for all people. And I think, like I say, really the book at the end of it really invites people to examine their lives, and it gives you sort of 8 places to start looking. So it's just some overall points along the way. One, the most uncharitable way of looking at the book is to say there's nothing new here. This is all basic stuff. But I think that would be an unfair, and it would probably be wrong, because, when someone's basing their recommendations on ancient wisdom, there shouldn't be anything new. The point here is that there's a very strong and clear reminder of how modern people often find themselves opposing ancient wisdom. And I think this book gives a really strong impetus on how to address some of these conflicts in our own lives. The chapters that I enjoyed most were the ones that I guess were most novel, probably meaning that they were the most missing from the positive psychology literature. So the chapter that I've heard him mention already on a different podcast, so I'm happy to mention it as well, was about this idea of moderation, and moderation as an inverted U shape. So this idea, if you think of an upside down U, things that are good for you, too much of them or too little of them can be unhelpful. And I think that was a nice idea of, this, again, this kind of call to reflect on your life, rather than sort of like saying, here's what you do, a call to reflect on how much of this thing that's good for you is the right amount for the right context. And so there are lots of examples, I think, that come to mind from the positive psychology literature. Things like flow being the optimal amount of stress for the right amount of growth, where too much or too little stress can cause issues. And I think Gad, to be honest, would really enjoy reading Lindsay Odes' wellbeing literacy work. And Lindsay was obviously the latest guest that we've had on the show. where he talks, a lot of the concepts are really overlapping, particularly Lindsay's emphasis on contextually relevant communication about and for well-being. This idea that exactly as Gad lays it out, there is no absolute good thing. It's all relative when it comes to our well-being. So this idea of being contextually appropriate, I think he would really get a kick out of reading Lindsay's work, as most people do. And the second chapter that I really like was about authenticity, and why I liked it was that it framed authenticity, as I said, I think at the start of the episode, it really framed like this good thing, this thing like authenticity, and the wellbeing literature's covered off authenticity a million times. But what the research world, I don't think, has done is framed authenticity as a really valuable thing for a real world problem. And so if you watched the episode last week where I did a bit of a breakdown on my key takeaways from IPPA, it was a fellow Canadian migrant, Tayyab Rashid, who really emphasized in a talk about improving the world of post-psych. He really emphasized this idea that to be relevant in the world, positive psychology has to be focused and oriented towards real world problems, or face the prospect of, like I say, becoming irrelevant. And I think this was a really, really interesting chapter demonstrating that exact point. So Gad introduced the chapter of authenticity, but contextualizes it in the face of big issues that modern society face. So I won't go into the detail too much, but talking about it in like almost like contextualizing it in the discussion around anti-fragility, around victim mentality, the rise of echo chambers. You really get this sense that when someone gives you advice like authenticity is good for you, you go like, yeah, everything's good for me. Like there's lots of things I can worry about. But when you frame it in opposition to something that you're concerned about, it becomes so much more valuable. And I guess that's the marketing professor coming through. But it was basically an example of what Tayyab Rashid was calling for. And I think that's a really useful chapter, if nothing else, just to pick that up as a style, as a communication style. I think the newest part for me was probably looking at happiness through an evolutionary lens. And that was certainly not something I've seen very commonly in the wellbeing or the post-psych literature. An example of this is probably, you might have heard is, not in the book, but just an example that you may have come across is like, something like the negativity bias, where we talk about it as being something that's helped us to survive, but not necessarily to thrive. So talking about, our ancestors, the ones that were focused on noticing the beautiful things and admiring beauty, weren't the ones who survived. The ones that survived were those who were focusing on threats and always sort of vigilant. And that's left us with this evolutionary trait. So it was interesting to hear most of these chapters really break down an evolutionary sort of explanation of what might have produced some of these sort of natural traits that we have as humans. But importantly, sort of suggested some ways that we could actually override or even divert these natural instincts into something that can be a bit more productive for ourselves and our sense of happiness. So along the way, there are instructive anecdotes about Gad's life. I think if you're a fan of Gad, you're going to get a nice insight into his life, which is just nice when you have sort of like an online personality that you like to support. If you haven't been a fan, I think it's still going to be interesting basically for you. So, look, the book is already a bestseller. It's clearly Gad has a huge audience in Australia, which is just unexpected but interesting. The book is already a top seller in Australia. I think it's definitely worth checking out. It's a bit of a breath of fresh air. I think it's something different. It's fun, like I said. It's a brief read, and so I would recommend to check it out. Just checking through my notes, but I think that's basically it. Yeah, I mean, just the fact, I think he was on Joe Rogan's podcast for the 9th time, so it's like, this will be the greatest, most sold happiness book. I shouldn't say greatest. I mean, the most sold happiness book of all time, just as a product of the current literatures, of the current environment. So, yeah, I hope Gad sees this. I hope he enjoys it, and really keen, like more importantly, to hear what you think. Let me know, and if you've read the book or if you've got other books you'd like me to review, please let me know. You can, so all the other stuff, like subscribe to the show, find us on Spotify, on YouTube, subscribe everywhere, Apple Podcasts, and you can support the show on locals.com as well if this is something that you're interested in. So thank you, and enjoy.